The burning started 3 seconds after the shampoo touched my scalp. At first, I thought the water was too hot. Then came the pain, searing, screaming. Like someone had poured liquid fire directly onto my skull. I collapsed in the shower, clawing at my head as my skin began to blister and peel. My own screams echoed off the bathroom tiles, mixing with the hiss of water I desperately hoped would stop the agony. My sister Vivian stood in the doorway, her face pale, not with concern, but with the unmistakable look of someone caught. "It was just a prank," she whispered. When my father arrived, I expected him to call 911. Instead, he looked at me, his eldest daughter, shaking and bleeding on the bathroom floor, and said 5 words I'll never forget: "Relax. It was only a joke." They didn't call an ambulance. They went back to preparing his birthday party. 4 days later, my phone showed 80 missed calls from them. But I wasn't hiding. I was preparing. Have you ever discovered that your family's love came with conditions you never knew existed? My name is Alexandria Pierce. I'm 36 years old, a senior financial analyst at one of Dallas's most respected investment firms. I've spent 11 years building a career that commands respect, a salary that affords me independence, and a life that belongs entirely to me. None of which my family knows because I stopped telling them years ago. I hadn't been home in 18 months when my father called about his 60th birthday. That alone should have been my first warning. Harold Pierce didn't make phone calls. He communicated through my mother, through guilt, through the unspoken expectation that good daughters simply showed up when summoned. But there he was, his voice strangely rehearsed, insisting I couldn't miss this milestone. Something felt wrong, but I told myself it was just the awkwardness of distance. I told myself a lot of things back then. The drive from Dallas to my parents' suburban Houston home takes 4 hours. 4 hours to watch the landscape flatten, to feel my shoulders tighten with every mile, to remember why I'd stayed away. My family hadn't asked about my promotion last year. They didn't know about my corner office, my team of 12, the clients who trusted me with millions. Every time I tried to share good news in the past, it was met with distracted nods before the conversation pivoted to my younger sister Vivian's latest drama. After a while, I stopped sharing. It was easier than watching my accomplishments disappear into the void of their indifference. Vivian was 33 and still living at home, temporarily. She'd claimed for 5 years now. She worked an administrative job at our father's friend's insurance company, a position that required minimal effort and maximum charm. And Vivian had charm in abundance. She was pretty engaging and devastatingly skilled at playing the victim. She was also cruel in ways our parents refused to see. I still remember the SAT exam. I was 17, desperate to escape to college, and Vivian had slipped laxatives into my drink the morning of the test. I spent 4 hours in agony, barely able to focus, while she told our parents I was just nervous. When I confronted her afterward, our father's response was swift: "Don't be so sensitive. Sisters play pranks." I was expected to apologize for making a scene. At 22, Vivian sent a fake termination email that appeared to come from my company's HR department. I spent 3 days in panic before she revealed it was just a joke. Again, I was the one who overreacted. The pattern was always the same. Vivian struck. I bled, and I apologized for bleeding. That first evening home during dinner, my father mentioned casually that he needed me to sign some property documents. Something about the Galveston beach house, the one he'd put my name on years ago for tax purposes. I'd signed papers at 25 without reading them, because that's what Pierces did. We trusted family. We didn't ask questions. I nodded and agreed, the way I always had. Later, I passed the kitchen and heard my mother whispering to Vivian. I caught only fragments: "Tomorrow morning, before the party, then your father will handle the rest," before they noticed me and fell silent. My mother smiled too quickly, claiming they were discussing party logistics. It didn't feel like party logistics. That night, preparing for bed, I noticed my shampoo bottle had been moved. The cap was loose, not twisted tight the way I always left it. I dismissed it as nothing. Someone must have borrowed it. I lay in my childhood bedroom thinking of my grandmother Eleanor, who died when I was 12. She'd once told me I reminded her of herself. "Promise me you'll never let anyone, especially family, make you feel small," she'd said. I wondered if she'd somehow known what her son's family would become. I was almost asleep when Vivian appeared in my doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light. "Sleep well, sis," she said, her voice carrying something I couldn't quite identify. "Tomorrow's going to be memorable." I assumed she meant the birthday party. I had no idea I was the real event. I woke early the next morning before the sun had fully risen. The house was quiet, and I wanted to shower and dress before the chaos of party preparations began. I told myself the unease in my stomach was just the usual discomfort of being home. I told myself Vivian's strange comment the night before meant nothing. I was very good at telling myself things that weren't true. The bathroom was cold when I stepped in. I turned on the water, waited for it to warm, and reached for my shampoo bottle. The moment I squeezed it into my palm, something felt wrong. The texture was different, thinner, almost watery instead of the thick consistency I knew. And the smell, sharp, chemical, nothing like the lavender scent I had used for years. But my brain was still waking up, still processing, and before I could stop myself, I had already worked it into my scalp. The first 3 seconds were confusion. The liquid felt strange against my skin, almost slippery in a way that made no sense. By the 5th second, confusion became pain. Not warmth, not mild discomfort. Searing, screaming agony that spread across my scalp like someone had set my head on fire. By 7 seconds, I was on my knees in the shower, clawing at my own head, feeling my hair clump and stick to skin that was already starting to blister. I screamed. I screamed so loud my throat tore. I screamed because the pain was beyond anything I had ever experienced, beyond anything I could have imagined. I managed to turn on the cold water flooding my head, desperately trying to wash away whatever was burning through my skin. But even as the water ran, the pain kept deepening. I would learn later that sodium hydroxide creates a chemical reaction with water and skin. The burns continue spreading, even as you rinse. The cold water I thought was saving me was actually driving the chemical deeper into my tissue. I don't know how long I was on that shower floor. It felt like hours. It was probably minutes. At some point, I became aware of someone standing in the doorway. Vivian. Her face was pale, but even through the agony clouding my vision, I recognized her expression. It wasn't shock at an accident. It wasn't horror at something unexpected. It was fear. The specific fear of someone who had been caught. "Oh, God," she said, her voice high and thin. "I didn't think it would burn like that. The video said it would just make your hair fall out." I forced words through the pain, each syllable feeling like broken glass in my throat. "What did you do?" And then she told me. She told me everything. "I just wanted to take you down a peg," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "You always come home acting like you're so much better than us with your fancy job and your Dallas apartment. Mom said it would be good for you to feel small for once. She said after you calmed down, you'd be more cooperative." Cooperative. The word cut through the pain sharper than any chemical burn. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. This wasn't a prank that went wrong. This was planned. My mother was involved. They had discussed this. They had decided to hurt me deliberately, to break me down, to make me cooperative. For what? Before I could process that question, my father appeared in the doorway. Harold Pierce looked at the scene before him. His eldest daughter on the bathroom floor, skin peeling, crying in agony. His youngest daughter confessing to what she had done. And his response revealed everything about who he really was. "Everyone stop. Stop." His voice was controlled, cold, completely calm. "Vivian, go to your room. Patricia, get some towels." He looked at me, not with concern, not with the horror any normal parent would feel seeing their child injured. He looked at me with calculation, like I was a problem to be managed. "We are not calling anyone," he said. "Do you understand? We're not calling 911. We're not going to a hospital. We're not creating any records. You'll clean up, put some ointment on it, and we'll get through today. I have 40 guests arriving in 4 hours." I stared at him through tears, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. "Dad, I need a doctor. This is serious." "What you need is to stop being dramatic. We'll deal with this privately. After the party, after you've signed the property papers, we can discuss next steps, as a family." The property papers, even now with my scalp burned and blistering, that was what he cared about. My signature on documents I hadn't even read. My mother appeared with towels. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look shocked or horrified at what had happened to her daughter. She looked like someone whose plan had gone sideways and was now focused entirely on damage control. No one called for help. No one offered to take me to a hospital. My family left me on that bathroom floor and went back to preparing for a birthday party. I managed to keep rinsing with cold water for another 15 or 20 minutes. The pain had dulled to a constant throbbing agony that made it hard to think. With shaking hands, I found my phone and called the only person in Houston I trusted. Megan Torres had been my college roommate. She stayed in Houston, became a physical therapist, and remained the closest thing I had to real family in this city. She arrived in 35 minutes. When she saw me, she nearly called 911 herself. I stopped her. "Just get me out of here," I begged. "Please, I can't explain right now." At the emergency room, the attending physician examined my scalp with an expression that grew grimmer by the second. "Second-degree chemical burns across 40% of your scalp," she said. "Some areas approaching third degree. The substance was sodium hydroxide, industrial drain cleaner." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "Who did this to you?" I told her the truth. "My sister? My family?" Her expression hardened. "This is mandatory reporting. Assault with a caustic substance is a second-degree felony in Texas. The police will be contacting you." She explained that the extended cold water rinse had likely saved some of my hair follicles, but the delay in getting professional treatment had caused unnecessary additional damage. Some areas had reached full-thickness burns. Third degree. The hair follicles there were completely destroyed. That hair would never grow back. "Why didn't you call 911?" the doctor asked. I didn't have an answer that made sense to anyone who hadn't lived in my family. Lying in that hospital bed, gauze wrapped around my head, I finally saw my family clearly. This wasn't a prank gone wrong. My mother told Vivian to do it. Said it would make me cooperative. Cooperative for what? The property papers. The Galveston house. Whatever my father needed me to sign. They didn't invite me home for a birthday celebration. They invited me to be broken down and manipulated. They were still waiting for me to sign. My phone buzzed. A text from my father. "The party was a success despite your theatrics. Come home tomorrow. Sign the property papers and we'll put this behind us. No lawyers. No drama. Family handles family." I read it twice. Then I turned off my phone, looked at Megan sitting beside my hospital bed, and said 5 words that would change everything. "I need a real lawyer." Finding a lawyer wasn't difficult. Finding the right one took me 2 days. Margaret Sullivan had built her reputation on family abuse cases, the kind most attorneys avoided, because they were messy and emotional and rarely made headlines. But Margaret understood something others didn't. She understood that the worst betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people who are supposed to love you. When I walked into her office with bandages still wrapped around my head and a folder of hospital photographs, she didn't flinch. She looked at the evidence, looked at me, and said 4 words that changed everything. "Tell me all of it." So I did. I told her about the shampoo, about my father's refusal to call an ambulance, about my mother's involvement, about the property papers they kept mentioning. Margaret listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather journal that looked like it had heard 1,000 terrible stories. When I finished, she picked up her phone and made a call. 20 minutes later, a man named David Park joined us. He specialized in real estate litigation, Margaret explained, and something about the property angle was bothering her. She wanted him to dig into it. While my legal team assembled, my family was falling apart. I know this because I watched it happen on my phone. 87 missed calls over 5 days, 53 text messages, 15 emails. The Pierce family had never experienced my absence like this. I had always been the reliable one, the one who answered calls on the first ring, the one who showed up when summoned, the one who smoothed over conflicts and apologized for things that weren't my fault. My silence terrified them in a way my presence never had. Day 1, my father's message was demanding. "Call me back. We need to discuss the paperwork." Day 2, his tone shifted to irritation. "This is childish Alexandria. Pick up." Day 3, my mother tried a different approach, her voice sweet with manufactured concern. "Honey, we're worried. At least let us know you're alive." Day 4, Vivian left a voicemail that almost made me laugh. "I'm so sorry, okay? It was just supposed to be a little prank. Please don't ruin everything." Day 5, my father's desperation finally broke through his control. "I'm considering calling police for a wellness check. This is your last chance to handle this like an adult." I saved every message, every voicemail, every text. I wasn't hiding from my family. I was building a case against them. David Park called me on the morning of the 5th day. What he had found made my blood run cold. The Galveston beach house, the one my father had put my name on 11 years ago for tax purposes, was worth $850,000. I had never known. I had never asked. He told me to sign papers, and I signed them because that's what Pierces did. But David had pulled those original documents, all 52 pages of them, and buried on page 47 was something I had never noticed. A blanket authorization, legal language giving my father power to use the property as collateral for future financing. I had signed away rights I didn't even know I had. "There's more," David said. "Your father took out a loan against the property 3 years ago, $280,000. I felt sick. How is that possible? I never signed anything for a loan. You didn't have to. The blanket authorization covered it. You gave him permission when you were 25 years old. Did you read what you were signing?" I hadn't. I had trusted my father. I had trusted family. The full picture emerged over the next few hours as David and Margaret pieced together the financial trail. My father's construction company had been failing for 3 years. When he couldn't make payroll, he used the blanket authorization to secure a loan against the Galveston house. The loan was coming due in 5 weeks. He couldn't repay it. He couldn't refinance. The only option was to sell the property. But because my name was on the deed, he needed my signature to complete any sale. Without it, he would default. He would lose not just the house, but everything. Bankruptcy. The end of the business he had spent 30 years building. Margaret laid out the documents on her conference table, and I stared at them as the truth finally clicked into place. "They didn't invite you home for a birthday party," she said. "They invited you home to be manipulated into signing away your rights. The prank wasn't random cruelty. It was strategy. A humiliated, isolated woman desperate for family acceptance would sign anything to make peace. They were trying to break you down emotionally so you wouldn't ask questions." I thought about my entire life, every dismissal, every ignored achievement, every time I was made to feel small while Vivian was celebrated. I had always believed my family simply didn't value me. The truth was worse. They valued me only as a resource to be exploited. I wasn't their daughter. I was their backup plan. That afternoon, Detective Rivera from Houston PD called. The hospital's mandatory report had triggered an investigation, and he needed my statement. I gave him everything. Medical records, photographs, the timeline of events, my suspicions about premeditation. Then I asked him for something in return. 48 hours before any arrests. I had one more piece of evidence to collect. I called my father that evening. Before I dialed, I enabled the recording function on my phone. Texas is a one-party consent state. I only needed my own permission to record. He would never know this conversation was being documented. I made my voice soft, wounded, uncertain. The voice of the daughter they had always expected me to be. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe I overreacted. I know how important family is to you." His relief was so obvious, it made my stomach turn. "That's my girl. I knew you'd come around. Come home this weekend. We'll get the paperwork sorted, put this whole mess behind us." "What paperwork exactly?" I asked. "I want to understand what I'm signing this time." A pause. Just a fraction of a second, but I heard it. "Just the sale documents for Galveston. We have a buyer lined up. Standard estate planning. And the loan. The $280,000 you took out against the house using papers I signed when I was 25. Dead silence. The kind of silence that tells you everything. "How do you know about that?" His voice had changed completely. The warmth was gone. "I know about all of it, Dad. The debt, the deadline, the plan to manipulate me into signing. I know why you really invited me home. Alexandria, whatever you're thinking, tell me the truth." Did Mom know about the prank before it happened? Was hurting me part of getting my signature? And then Harold Pierce panicked and desperate made the mistake that would destroy him. "Your mother was just trying to help Vivian, was only supposed to embarrass you a little, make you feel like you needed us again. Nobody planned for you to actually get hurt. We just needed you to sign without asking questions like you always do." I let the silence stretch for 3 seconds, then 4, then 5. "Thank you, Dad," I said quietly. That's all I needed. I hung up before he could respond. The recording app showed 4 minutes and 47 seconds. Every word captured, every confession documented. I forwarded the file to Detective Rivera, then to Margaret Sullivan. Then I saved 3 copies to cloud storage just to be safe. My family thought they were trapping me. They thought I would come home broken and desperate, sign whatever they put in front of me, and disappear back into my role as the invisible daughter who never asked questions. They never realized I had learned to build traps of my own. 17 days after that phone call, the traps I had built began to spring. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard about it from Detective Rivera later that afternoon. He arrived at my parents' house on a Tuesday morning with 2 uniformed officers and an arrest warrant. The neighbors had gathered on their lawns by then, drawn by the police cars parked in the driveway of the Pierce family home. The family that hosted holiday parties, the family that attended church every Sunday. The family that everyone believed was perfect. Vivian Pierce was charged with aggravated assault with a caustic substance, a second-degree felony in Texas, carrying 2 to 20 years in prison. They handcuffed her in front of everyone. Detective Rivera told me she cried the entire time, kept saying it was just a prank, kept insisting she didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. The neighbors watched in silence as she was placed in the back of a patrol car. By noon, the story was already spreading through the community, but the arrest was only the first delivery that Tuesday. The second came by registered mail. A letter from the Harris County District Attorney's Office informing Harold and Patricia Pierce that they were under investigation for conspiracy to commit assault and fraud. The recording had changed everything. This wasn't a prank gone wrong anymore. The evidence showed premeditation, planning, intent. My father's own words, captured in 4 minutes and 47 seconds, proved that hurting me was part of a scheme to manipulate my signature on property documents. The third delivery arrived an hour later. A certified letter from the law offices of Sullivan and Park announcing my civil lawsuit for damages, medical costs, pain and suffering, permanent disfigurement. The letter also contained my formal refusal to sign any documents related to the Galveston property and my intention to initiate partition proceedings. If my father wouldn't agree to sell the house and split the proceeds fairly, the court would force the sale. My share would be protected. His share would go directly to his creditors. My father called me that evening. I answered once, just once. "You've destroyed this family," he said. His voice shook with rage, but underneath it, I heard something else. Fear. The fear of a man watching everything he built collapse around him. "No, Dad," I replied. My voice was calm, steady. The voice of someone who had finally stopped being afraid of her own family. "You destroyed this family the moment you decided I was worth more as a victim than as a daughter. Everything goes through my lawyers now." I hung up before he could respond. It was the last time we ever spoke. 1 week later, I received a phone call that would rewrite my entire history. The number wasn't familiar, but the area code was Houston. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and on the other end was a voice I hadn't heard in years. Aunt Helen Morrison, my mother's younger sister. She had distanced herself from the family when I was in my early 20s after some falling out that no one would explain. I had always wondered what happened between them. Now I was about to find out. "I heard what happened," Helen said. Her voice was unsteady, like she had been crying. "I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." She paused, gathering herself, and then the truth came pouring out. "I didn't know about most of it until later. Your mother would drop hints over the years, bragging when she'd had too much wine at family gatherings, making comments I didn't want to believe. But I should have believed them." Another pause. "When you lost your scholarship at 17, do you remember the financial aid office received an anonymous tip that you had a trust fund? You didn't have one, of course, but by the time they investigated and found nothing, the scholarship had already been given to someone else." My blood ran cold. I remembered that scholarship. I remembered how devastated I had been, how my dreams of attending my first-choice college evaporated overnight because of some mysterious tip that turned out to be false. "That was Patricia," Helen said. "Your mother. She told me about it years later, laughing like it was clever. She said it would keep you humble." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. There's more, Helen continued. Your engagement at 27, Marcus. Do you remember how suddenly he left? I remembered. I remembered the confusion, the heartbreak, the way he had looked at me like I was a stranger before he walked out of my life without explanation. He called me, Helen said. A few days after he left you. He was confused, asking if what Patricia told him was true. She had shown him evidence, he said. Screenshots of text messages, a list of your episodes, whatever that meant. Even medical records she had stolen from your purse, showing a prescription for anxiety medication after your grandmother died. She framed you as emotionally unstable. By the time I tried to tell him the truth, he had already made up his mind. I sat in my apartment, the phone pressed to my ear, feeling my entire life reshape itself around this new information. Every failure, every heartbreak, every coincidence that had seemed like bad luck. It was never bad luck, it was my mother, systematically sabotaging me for nearly 2 decades. I should have told you years ago, Helen said, her voice breaking. I kept hoping she would change. I kept telling myself it couldn't really be as bad as it seemed. When I heard about the drain cleaner, I called Patricia. I asked her how she could let something like that happen to her own daughter. Do you know what she said? She told me to mind my own business. Helen was crying now. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I'm sorry, Alexandria. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I thanked her. I told her it wasn't her fault, and after I hung up, I sat alone in the dark for a very long time, letting the weight of 36 years of maternal betrayal settle over me. The public unraveling happened faster than I expected. Vivian's arrest was public record, and the Houston Chronicle ran a story within days. The headline was simple and devastating. Houston woman arrested for chemical attack on sister. The comments section filled with speculation. Some people defended Vivian, saying it must have been an accident. Others demanded the maximum sentence. Everyone had an opinion about the Pierce family now. The carefully maintained image my parents had spent decades constructing shattered overnight. Friends who had attended their parties suddenly became unavailable. Business partners canceled meetings. My father's construction company, already struggling, lost 2 major contracts when clients decided they would rather not be associated with the name. Vivian posted $50,000 bail and returned home only to discover that her administrative job had been eliminated in a convenient restructuring. My mother stopped leaving the house entirely. The whispers followed them everywhere. 3 weeks after Aunt Helen's call, my mother came to Dallas. She appeared in the lobby of my apartment building without warning. Mascara streaked down her face, looking a decade older than she had a month before. Security called up to ask if I wanted to see her. I considered refusing. Then I decided she deserved to hear the truth face to face. I found her standing near the elevators, clutching her purse like a lifeline. The woman who had controlled every aspect of my childhood now looked small and defeated. Drop the charges, Jay, she begged. Drop the lawsuit. We'll give you anything, the whole house, whatever you want. Just please don't destroy us. I studied her for a long moment. This woman who gave me life and spent 36 years systematically diminishing it. When I was 17, I lost my scholarship, I said quietly. When I was 27, I lost my engagement. When I was 36, I almost lost my life. Each time I thought it was just bad luck, thought I just wasn't good enough, but it was you, every single time. Her face crumbled. How did you... Aunt Helen told me everything. Every sabotage, every lie, every time you made sure I failed so Vivian could feel like the successful one. I stood up. This conversation is over. Everything goes through Sullivan and Park now. And Mom, I hope whatever you thought you'd gain was worth losing a daughter, because that's exactly what you've lost. I walked to the elevator without looking back. 4 months later, the criminal proceedings concluded and the sentences were handed down. But justice, I learned, doesn't always come from courtrooms. Sometimes it comes from the quiet collapse of everything your enemies spent their lives building. And sometimes it comes from the most unexpected place of all. The unexpected place turned out to be a care facility in Arizona, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First came the verdicts. Vivian accepted a plea deal to avoid trial. 3 years in state prison, eligible for parole after 18 months. Her defense attorney argued undue influence, painting her as a young woman manipulated by her parents into doing something terrible. The judge partially accepted this argument. But the evidence of premeditation was undeniable. The research into chemicals, the deliberate purchase of industrial drain cleaner, the severity of my injuries. Prison time was unavoidable. She was sent to the Gatesville facility 4 hours from Houston. I never visited. I never wrote. I received updates occasionally through Aunt Helen, who felt obligated to keep some connection with her niece despite everything. Vivian was released after 19 months, thinner and quieter than before. The felony record follows her now and will follow her forever. No professional licenses. Mandatory disclosure on every job application. Her name permanently linked to chemical assault in any internet search. She is 35 years old and will spend the rest of her life explaining the worst thing she ever did. My parents faced conspiracy charges, but proving criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt turned out to be difficult. The recording helped, but a good defense attorney could argue that my father's panicked words didn't constitute actual planning of the assault itself. The district attorney offered a deal. Charges reduced to reckless endangerment, a Class A misdemeanor. My father received 1 year of probation and a $5,000 fine. My mother, whose role as instigator was clearly documented in the recording, received 90 days in county jail, served in 30-day increments due to her age, plus 3 years of probation. It wasn't prison, but it was public. Every time she thought it was over, she had to go back. 3 separate times, Patricia Pierce reported to the Harris County Jail to serve another month. 3 separate times, the neighbors watched her leave in the morning and return 4 weeks later. The humiliation, I think, was almost worse than a longer sentence served all at once. The civil case settled for $425,000. Payment for my medical costs, my ongoing treatment, my permanent disfigurement, and my pain and suffering. The money came from my father's depleted retirement account, withdrawn with penalty. From my mother's inheritance from her own mother money she had kept separate for years. From the sale of my father's hunting cabin in East Texas, a property he had owned for 20 years. They weren't bankrupted, but the financial wound will ache for the rest of their lives. And then there was the beach house. I followed through on the partition sale. The Galveston property, the one my father had schemed and manipulated and sacrificed his own daughter to keep, went on the market. It sold for $815,000. After realtor fees and closing costs, after my father's $280,000 loan was satisfied from his share, the math was simple. He received $94,000. Enough to stay afloat, not enough to rebuild, not enough to save the construction company that had been failing for years. I received $314,000. I donated $75,000 to the National Burn Survivor Foundation, specifically earmarking the funds for victims of family violence. The rest became my freedom fund. A down payment on a condo I chose myself in a neighborhood where no one knows the name Pierce. My father, now 62 years old, watched strangers move into the beach house where 3 generations of his family had celebrated holidays. The legacy he was willing to destroy his daughter to protect is gone anyway. That's not justice. That's irony. 6 months after the legal dust settled, I received a letter. The envelope was addressed in unfamiliar handwriting, which I would later learn belonged to a nurse at the care facility. But the signature at the bottom was unmistakable, despite its tremor. Grandpa Harold Sr. He was 88 years old now, still in Arizona, his hands too shaky for writing, but his mind still sharp. The letter was typed with a handwritten signature that wobbled across the page. Dear Alexandria. It began. Helen visited me. She told me everything. I'm 88 years old and thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong. I'm ashamed. Not of you. Never of you. I'm ashamed of my son. Your grandmother saw this cruelty in Harold when he was young, and I dismissed her concerns. I told her boys will be boys, that family loyalty mattered most. She was right. I was a fool, and you paid for my foolishness. But you also proved Eleanor right about something else. She always said you were the strongest of her grandchildren. Not loud, not aggressive. Steady. You knew your worth, even when no one else did. What you did took more courage than anything I've managed in 88 years. The trust Eleanor set up is yours now. She made me promise to keep it hidden from Harold, and I have. It's not a fortune. $127,000 and some change. But it's yours, free and clear. Helen will handle the paperwork. Consider it Eleanor's apology for the family she married into and mine for the son I raised. You have nothing to apologize for. nothing to prove, and somewhere your grandmother is proud. With love, Grandpa. P.S. I've told Harold exactly what I think of him. He knows now that the family legacy he destroyed wasn't a house. It was you. I read that letter 3 times, then I cried. Not from pain, not from grief, from something I hadn't felt from family in 36 years, the feeling of being truly seen. 20 months after the attack, I hosted Thanksgiving in my new condo. The table seated 6. Megan Torres, who had dropped everything to rescue me from that bathroom, brought homemade tamales from her mother's recipe. Margaret Sullivan, who had become as much a mentor as an attorney, brought wine and stories of other survivors who had rebuilt their lives. Aunt Helen, finally free from her sister's shadow, brought a framed photograph of Grandma Eleanor, the woman I never really knew, but somehow always channeled. 3 other friends filled the remaining seats, people who knew me only as the competent, successful woman I had built myself into, not as the victim my family tried to create. There was no Pierce family drama at that table, no manipulation, no schemes, no hidden agendas, just people who chose to be there sharing food and genuine warmth. The scar on my scalp has healed as much as it ever will. There's a patch near my crown about 2 inches across where hair will never grow again. I've learned to style around it. Some days I don't bother. It's not a mark of what was done to me. It's proof of what I survived. My phone buzzed as my guests settled in for pie. A notification from my bank. Grandpa's trust had officially transferred. $127,000 and change. Money my grandmother Eleanor had hidden for decades, waiting for exactly this moment. I smiled and put the phone away. The money was welcome, but it wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the 6 people laughing in my living room, the career I had built with my own hands, the peace I had earned through fire, literally. Some people only learn the value of love after they've lost the right to stay in your life. Some families are blood, some are chosen, and some are simply survived. I raised my glass to the people who actually wanted me there. To family, I said. And for the first time in 36 years, I meant it. Alexandria's story reminds us of a truth many people learn too late. Love should never require you to shrink yourself, and family should never be an excuse for cruelty. If someone repeatedly hurts you and calls it a joke, that is not humor. That is abuse wearing a mask. If someone dismisses your pain to protect their own comfort, they have shown you exactly where you stand in their priorities. Believe them. Setting boundaries is not betrayal. Walking away from people who harm you is not cruelty. It is survival. It is self-respect. And sometimes it is the bravest thing you will ever do. Alexandria spent 36 years believing she was not good enough because her family made her feel that way. The moment she stopped seeking their approval and started trusting her own worth, everything changed. She did not need their love to be whole. She needed her own. For those of you who have lived through something similar, who have been the family scapegoat or the one expected to sacrifice and stay silent, know this. You are not alone. Your pain is valid. Your story matters. And you deserve people who choose you, not people who use you. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart or reminded you of your own journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. We share new videos every week, stories of strength, survival, and the courage it takes to reclaim your life. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from family to protect yourself? What did that experience teach you? Your words might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. Share your thoughts and let us build a community of people who understand that true family is not always blood. Sometimes it is simply the people who show up and stay.